Hamza Khan, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations podcast.
Dr. Westover. Sorry, John. Thank you so much for having me.
It is a pleasure to be with you. I believe you're joining us from the New York area, aren't you?
You got it, sir. From Hell's Kitchen.
Wonderful. And I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. We are getting dumped on currently. It's the winter that never ends. It's a record year. I think some of the snow resorts have received like 800 inches of snow this year so far.
No way.
And it's still coming, which is good because we've been in drought like much of the West. And so
all
of the water is really good and important to replenish the reservoirs and everything. But man, my goodness, we woke up this morning and it felt like Christmas. So
oh man.
Hopefully it's getting a little warmer there in New York.
It's a strange dark upside to global warming over here. We never really had a winter. How are things in Salt Lake City in May?
I mean, it's usually beautiful, very lovely.
Okay.
By this point in time, it's usually, nice in spring and blossoms, and it's going to be a bit delayed this year. So we'll see.
All right. I'm going to be heading there right after a short trip with my niece to Disneyland, to Salt Lake, to speak at a conference, the AICPA and CIMA conference. So I think I'll be appropriately clothed.
Yes. And perhaps you'll still have some great skiing even in May. We'll see.
Love it. Looking forward to it.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Today, we're going to be
Thank you.
talking about reinventing leadership for the future of work. And I'm super thrilled to explore this topic with you. It's one that I'm passionate about as well. As we get started, I wanted to share Hamza's bio with everybody. Hamza Khan is a best-selling author and global keynote speaker whose TED Talk, Stop Managing, Start Leading, has been viewed nearly 2 million times. He is a top-ranked university educator and respected thought leader whose insights have been featured by notable media outlets such as Vice, Business Insider, the Globe and Mail. Hamza is trusted by the world's preeminent organizations to enhance human potential and optimize performance. His clients include the likes of Microsoft, PepsiCo, LinkedIn, Deloitte, Salesforce, TikTok, and over 100 colleges and universities. As the co-founder of Skills Camp, a leading soft skills training company, he is on a mission to empower organizations to thrive in the future of work. From Fortune 500 boardrooms to international conferences, he regularly shares actionable insights on the topics of leadership, resilience, and productivity. I think all of that is tremendous. Thank you again for joining me. Anything else you would like to share by way of your background or personal context before we dive on into the conversation?
Thank you, sir. That was a very, very generous introduction. And I was smiling. I was feeling very proud of all the accomplishments that I've been able to have over the last 15 years of my career. But having read your bio, having read up on you, I was like, oh man, I'm a baby over here. I'm a spring chicken compared to Dr. Westover and the work that you've done. And so I'm just very glad to be here. I'm honored to be in your presence, to join the pantheon of guests that you brought on this podcast and to learn. What's that saying? When one teaches, two learn. So thank you for gifting me an opportunity to share with your audience today. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I believe that you have the career that I'm trying to emulate. You've extended and are continuing to extend the runway of what's possible for me as somebody who hopes to have as storied and as successful as a career as you do. So thank you, sir, for everything that you do. If you want to know more about me, it's I'm trying to become you.
Well, that is very kind. I appreciate that. Again, really a pleasure to be with you. And it is a privilege to sit down every day and to have these wonderful conversations with thought leaders and executives and otherwise organizational leaders from across the globe. It's fantastic. It's so enriching to me. So I really appreciate you taking the time. Well, why don't we dive on in?
Okay.
And maybe you can share a little bit about the reinvented piece. So you have this recent book
Right.
where, the introduction to this episode is really taken from that book, Reinventing Leadership for the Future of Work. Tell us about the book, why the book, why now? What do you mean by reinventing leadership?
Wow. Yeah, thank you for asking that. Unlike the first book that I wrote, The Burnout Gamble, which took me just under 3 years to write every single day, piece by piece, I was able to crank out Leadership Reinvented in the span of, I think, 3 months. And I wrote about this in the epilogue of my book. I wrote that this book practically wrote itself. I found myself in a unique situation in which I was primed to observe the world in a different way. My father experienced a health scare during the early days of the pandemic that was brought upon by stress, disorientation, and all the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that we feel profoundly in 2023, but I just became acutely aware of in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. And it changed the way that I looked at the leadership apparatus across government, nonprofit, and corporations that was entrusted to guide us through this pandemic. And the idea that kept on running through my brain was this: how you prepare today is how you'll perform tomorrow. And the way in which I saw people performing, specifically leaders performing during the early days of the pandemic, led me to believe that we need a reinvention of leadership, specifically that set of values that we sync to during times of crisis, especially during periods of change. There's this misconception that people step up during a time of change, step up during a crisis, but the opposite is true. They actually sink back to the level of their training, values, and preparation. So again, how you prepare today is how you'll perform tomorrow. And frankly, I was just very discouraged by what I was seeing, specifically in the corporate sector, especially in the government. And we're seeing this now play out in the prolonged failure to respond to what is clearly a paradigm shift in the future of work that has happened since the pandemic. You know, Gallup is consistently finding, I think now 10 years straight, that most of the workforce is disengaged. I think 85% was the most recent State of the Workplace report that found that 85% of the global workforce is disengaged. Edelman is finding that with their trust barometer, that trust in NGOs and government and business is declining precipitously. Life expectancy is dropping for the first time, actually, in the United States. Life expectancy is dropping wild. Inequality is growing. Workplace stress-related illness, injuries, and fatalities are on the rise. I mean, I could go on. And, you know, John, I'm preaching to the choir over here, but I've walked away from this experience, having watched leaders stumble through their pandemic, that the world of work isn't really working for most people, including leaders.
Yeah.
So this book was very much written as a call to action to distill my thoughts, to organize my thoughts around this, and to help us create a new system that we can sync back to during times of stress and change that will inevitably happen. One that is profoundly human-centric, pro-social, as opposed to the styles of leadership. And I use the word leadership loosely over here. We're talking about management specifically that people sync to, that are remnants of the first and second industrial revolution, namely the Theory X style of management, dominance-oriented leadership, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I really like how you highlighted how we tend to sink down to our base level of competency and skill in times of crisis. So sometimes we do point to glowing examples, and there were some. I mean, there were lots of bad examples during the pandemic, but there were some glowing examples too. And we really pointed to those, and we say, look, these people rose to the occasion. I'm not so sure they rose to the occasion. It's just the occasion allowed for the spotlight to be on them for how good they are always, right?
Yeah.
But what really happened is, in so many cases, leaders just weren't up to the challenge at all, not even remotely. And then you see all of the negative things that were happening during that time. And as you said, you know, it's not just early days of the pandemic that people were floundering. I mean, it's still today, and we're still looking, you know, trying to figure out how to staff organizations when the whole attitude around work and flexibility and everything like that has shifted for so many people. The psychological contract has shifted. People just want different things, and yet many of the old school leaders, quote unquote leaders, like you said, more like managers, they want things to just neatly go back to the way they were before. And that's just not the world we live in.
And John, on that note, I'd love to ask you, because this is the question that I get asked the most when I do workshops and training. I'm always asked what advice I would give to organizations, specifically leaders that are insisting on their knowledge workers returning to a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 mandated work week, I should say. And I find that I'm pulling my punches and not saying what I truly feel. I don't know why I feel like this conversation with you is emboldening me as somebody that is thinking about this to a degree that I hope to have that level of sophistication and vast foresight and insight and even wisdom about this. So I'm curious to know, John, not to put you on the spot here, but I know you're being asked the same question as well. How have you been guiding leaders through?
Yeah, I have been asked that same question a lot. And maybe I don't pull punches, but it's insane. Like, it's crazy. If you think
I was not expecting that answer.
if you think you're just going to go back to the way things were and that it's going to work, you're crazy. You're up in the night. Your head's in the sand. Now I'll say, with the caveat that, of course, every organization is unique, has its own unique context. So there are situations where it makes complete sense for workers to go back to work. Even thought leader, knowledge worker types of jobs where they literally could be done anywhere. It does make sense sometimes for people to be back together in the workplace.
Agreed.
But generally speaking, does that require them to always be back together? Probably not. And that's why hybrid work has become such a popular approach to allow the flexibility to adapt to the unique circumstances of a given team within a given organization. But if you're just going back to the way things always were before, for the vast majority of organizations, I just don't see how that makes any sense. And it's wishful thinking to think that you're just going to magically return. People's attitudes have shifted. Their priorities have shifted. What they want from the work that they do has shifted. And as you said, other things have unfortunately shifted in a negative way in terms of trust in organizations and institutions and those sorts of things. That's just the reality. And so we have to learn how to navigate this new reality. It's one of the reasons why we have such challenges hiring good people into organizations. Even with tens of thousands of people being laid off in the tech sector, we still have a shortage of highly skilled people, particularly in STEM fields and in healthcare and in some of those areas. And you, unless you're willing to rethink things and make sure you have a really good justification when you take away people's flexibility, unless you can do that and articulate that clearly, you're just going to lose the faith and trust of your people, and you're going to struggle to be an employer of choice and attract great talent. I don't see any other way around it.
Couldn't agree with you more. And with enough of a wide enough time scale, those organizations, I don't think will be able to cross the chasm of time. The onus is really on leaders and organizations to figure out an art of gathering and a true justification for why people should be synchronously in the same place. Man, that was very validating to hear, sir. Thank you. You have given me the ability to stand up with my chest puffed out and say what's on my mind, truly.
Yes. Well, sometimes it isn't well received, when I say, dude, you're crazy. But sometimes people need to hear it, because sometimes you just need a little bit of tough love, and for someone to actually give you a reality check. And I have seen some leaders who, they're wading into it and they're kind of hesitant, but they're kind of feeling it out. Those aren't the people I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people that are full on retrenched, really trying to, argue for a return to the good old days. And that's just insane. That's insanity to me.
And, perhaps at risk of never being asked by Amazon to do any work with them, I was most surprised by Andy Jesse's email, which had no qualification whatsoever for his desire to get people back into the office. He was just layering that email with platitudes like, I feel like we do better work when we're in the office. I'm like, well, sir, show me the stats, because I can show you MIT Sloan reports. I can show you McKinsey reports, differences in workplace dimensions related to well-being. Like, what are we talking about, Andy? So I sometimes try my best to assume ignorance before I do malevolence, but I can't help but wonder if some of these leaders are using this as an opportunity to shake things up in their organization and get rid of some talent. Maybe. I don't know.
I think that's definitely part of it for some organizations. It's a great catalyst point. It's an inflection point for organizations, and it's a good way to sift. Now, we could argue all day long whether or not we think it's an appropriate mechanism for sifting, or whatever. But I do think that's probably why many organizations are going about, this kind of approach. And
it's unfortunate, because I believe that how you do one thing is how you do all things. And so if that's the, sort of unethical way that they're going about sifting, it's very, it's antisocial. It's not in the best interest of employees. Although that could be argued, but I agree, and I think way to do things.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think one of the things we clearly know by now, with the research that's been done, is that flexible work arrangements disproportionately positively impact, minorities, people of color, women, etc. And the opposite is true. So when you force everyone to go into the workplace physically, then you disproportionately negatively impact those same populations. And so you better have a good justification for it. If you don't, then whether it's your intent or not, then you bring into question equal employment opportunity, and discrimination and all sorts of things. which, even if it doesn't cross the legal threshold of, something that you could get sued for,
Right.
it definitely raises, it's a moral question and it's an ethical question for sure.
That's fascinating. I never actually thought of the mandated return to work as an equity issue, but you're absolutely right. For the CEO who bought their house in 2003 to insist on everybody coming back to the downtown core when people have been priced out is truly an equity issue when you think about it. Huh. Wow.
Yeah.
We're like
So
5 minutes in and
it,
my head is spinning already. This is
it's
wild.
just another layer to all of this, right?
Yeah.
And so, as you talk again in your book about reinventing leadership for the
Yes.
future of work, we just have to take into account the new realities. Obviously, there's all sorts of disruptive technologies that are allowing us to more effectively than ever work remotely or work in hybrid fashion. It's one thing if 10 years ago someone would said, I really insist that everyone be together physically in the workplace so we can be productive. That's an argument I would buy a little bit more.
Sure.
But now it's a hard argument for me to buy into, because we've enhanced things so dramatically over the last several years. We've just leaped ahead, a decade in terms of where we were at, people's buy into the different technologies. And so at this point, you better have a really good justification for it. The part of the challenge I think that many old school leaders are facing is they just don't know how to lead or manage in this modern world of work with people working remotely, because their style required them to have control. Their style required them to wander around the office, to do visual check-ins, and just
optics, right? Yeah.
the optics and the personal presence.
Yep.
All of that was really important to their style. And now they're like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know how to hold people accountable. I don't know what they're doing. And so in many cases, even those who have allowed for remote work to continue, they've put in place all of these ridiculous monitoring protocols so they can still see what everyone's doing all the time. And that's just not what people want. It's not, if we talk about the negative impacts of micromanaging, same applies if you're not together physically. If you're remotely and you're still being micromanaged because your keystrokes are being monitored and you're being checked in on multiple times a day, that's not the type of environment people want to work in, where most people will thrive.
Exactly. And you had a wonderful episode that I just listened to actually this morning on psychological safety that I would encourage listeners who are just tuning in for this episode to go back and listen to that. I can't remember the name of the guest that you had on, John, but fantastic episode. You're absolutely right. And I'm fascinated and obsessed with why leaders behave this way, especially during times of crisis and stress. And I think so much of it has to do with fear. The fear of a loss of resources, the threat of a loss of resources or insufficient reward following a gain in less resources. And that's actually not my own idea. That's the Stephen A. Hopfall conservation of resources theory. And so when that happens, then counterproductive workplace behaviors start to set in within the leadership and across the organization. People become more protective and the organization becomes more closed. And then you know this better than anyone else, Dr. Westover, the Katz and Khan open and closed system theory. Basically, a closed organization is one that's not engaging with the world around in any meaningful way. And as a result, the nucleus, the core of the organization, festers. And so organizations, specifically leaders, need to become more open and do the counterintuitive thing during a time of change, to actually talk to your employees, to talk to your customers, to talk to your friends and family, and get as much information as possible versus making decisions in a silo. And I think one of the unfortunate decisions being made in the silo right now is whether or not to come back into the office. I was part of these conversations in the last organization I was with. We would just sit, the four of us in a leadership team, and just talk about people that weren't at the table. We're making decisions about people that weren't at the table. And so that was frustrating. And I'm seeing this happening at scale. And I think, again, how you do one thing is how you do all things. And so if that's the MO in the organization, to make decisions about us without us, then that to me is indicative of the organization being closed, which then introduces a whole host of other problems.
Yeah, openness and transparency in the modern age is so important. People expect it. It's one of the reasons why trust has gone down in institutions and in organizations, because they just don't see. And it doesn't mean that leaders have nefarious purposes or nefarious agendas, or that they're ill intent or anything like that. Like, it doesn't mean all of that necessarily, but that's what people assume when things are closed off. And so you just have to recognize, your tendency might be to close things off, to be self-protective, in times of crisis. And really what you need to do is you need to be more open, more transparent, talk to more people, listen harder, and that will serve you very well. And everything you've been talking about today has been focused around a people-centric organizational mindset, right? An organizational model that focuses on people first. And again, that is a bit of a shift. I know there's certainly plenty of organizations that have shifted in that direction. There are plenty of leaders that have shifted in that direction in recent years, but the vast majority still are kind of this old school, mentality around top-down, autocratic leadership styles and do what I say. It just doesn't work nowadays. If you focus on people, the positive metrics will come. The ROI is clear on investment in your people, your greatest asset within the organization. You'll create more, you'll have more innovation, you'll provide better value to the market, you'll have better customer retention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, that's what's going to help organizations thrive and stay relevant in the modern and future world of work. And if you don't do those things, like you said, you stagnate, and eventually you just become increasingly irrelevant. Like you just aren't going to matter.
And there's so many case studies we can rehearse of organizations that became closed, that didn't put their people first. I mean, the downside to me is crystal clear. And what I'm struggling with now, Doctor, is sorry, that's just a force of habit. I once had a professor that dressed me down for not referring to her as a doctor, but then she changed my mind about it too. She's like, I worked really hard to earn this. And I'm like, you know what? Someday I hope to get a PhD, and it would be cool to be called Dr. Khan as well. So let me put that energy out into the world.
Well, and I will say for female doctors, I think it's probably extra important for them to be acknowledged. For me, you're more than welcome to call me John, but my wife also has a doctorate, and I actually really would prefer that people refer to her as a Dr. Westover, because it's just a little bit of a different gendered situation, right, in society. So
completely understand that. My wife is currently a PhD candidate as well, and I feel very much the same way as you do, and which is why I'm curious to know, because I feel so much alignment with you, sir, so much synchronicity. Like I said in the opening, like you represented the career that I hope to emulate and wish to have at some point in the future. The downside is very clear to me for not practicing opening the organization. And I get sometimes stuck thinking that everything we're talking about right now seems so obvious. Put people first, treat your employees well. And if you treat your employees well, they'll take care of the customers, and customers will take care of the profits. This two-part question: is this obvious, or are we in a bubble? And the second question is, if it is obvious, or if the logic does seem sound, why is this not more widespread? Why is the opposite normalized?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and I do think it's actually fairly obvious. If you ask most leaders and you ask them, just the kind of the social norms and the desired response, most people realize, micromanaging bad, autocratic leadership bad, like cooperative. Most people recognize that. They'll say these types of things, but then they don't do these types of things, and they undermine their own ability. And it's not rocket science. It's not super complicated. I think most people tend to kind of recognize it, but where the rubber meets the road, when you find yourself in a moment of crisis, or you're feeling pressured by management above you, and you feel like the only response is to pressure the people below you so you can get the metrics, so you look good, blah, blah, blah. All of that puts the pressure on people. And the approach that we're talking about takes time. It takes persistence. It takes resilience, and you just have to be, there's no substitute for consistency over time. And in the short run, you might see worse results because you're not putting the screws to people.
Yes, right.
But in the long run, you'll foster greater trust. You'll foster greater accountability. You'll foster, people will just do more creative things because they're not being micromanaged, because they feel empowered. So in the long run, much better benefits. But we tend to be such a short-term oriented society that I think it's just harder for people, when push comes to shove. It's kind of, let me give you one quick example.
Sure. Yeah. This is great.
I'm a really slow typer. I'm not a great typer. I'm of the age before they started really doing typing in school. I'm old enough to kind of be in that group. So I never really learned how to type. I did some typing games and stuff like that a little bit. But I'm a hunt and pecker. So I'm a 3-finger person. Like I literally type with 3 fingers. Now I know full well that I will be a much better more effective typer. If I will just like practice 10 minutes a day, for a couple months, I'll be way better. Do I do it? No, I've never done it. I'm still a 3-finger typer. And I think it's the same thing for a lot of leaders. They know what they should do, but it requires a little bit of extra work in the short run that will pay long-term dividends. And they're just not willing to do it, or they have good intentions, but then they just fall back into bad habits.
Wow. And this is where now you've helped me understand sort of where and why I'm holding back from saying the thing that I want to say. So I truly believe that while I'm there doing work, helping organizations, helping leaders, helping teams operate within a capitalist paradigm, I also have the heart of an activist. And I'm kind of hoping that this revolution goes to the full extent that it can go. And there's one big union that forms that's in the best interest of employees, but that's too much. And that's not going to lend itself very well to a thriving speaking, publishing career. I also believe, though, that change should happen from within. I think that we can try as much as we want to shout and make change from without. And I'm not discrediting the work of activists. Again, like I said, I truly have the heart of an activist. I find that I'm at my most persuasive when I can convince people to work within their frameworks. And it's so interesting. One of the models that I've been relying on recently to help inform my work and my research is the destructive leadership matrix, which basically tries to reconcile the tension between what's good for the employee and what's good for the organization. And that dichotomy, like, do you focus too much on the organization at the expense of the employees, and do you focus too much on the employees on the opposite side? Do you focus too much on the employees at the expense of the organization? And I was recently watching the I think it's Howard Schultz, Starbucks, testify before Senate. And I was sitting there with that matrix, and I was just making notes in every quadrant of that. Like, hey, this is good for Starbucks. This is not good for employees. Okay, this is good for employees, but not good for Starbucks. And it was just fascinating to see that short-termism. I think he was trying to make decisions with the best of intentions for the shareholders of Starbucks. And as a shareholder of Starbucks, I'm like, I'm okay to not get a dividend for the next 5 years if you retool this company to be focused on employees, which is in the best interest of employees, customers, communities, and the planet. I'm okay. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Schultz. Just take care of your employees and we'll talk 10 years from now. But you're right, that short-term thinking is so hard-coded into the fabric of the workplace. So much so that I was surprised. I'm doing some research right now on B Corp and the evolution of B Corp and how that was a natural conclusion from ESG, and where did ESG come from? And I looked at CSR, the origins of CSR. And I know, Dr. Westover, you know this, so allow me to just explain how surprised I was as a very nascent researcher to find that the fundamental assumption in CSR is that profits come first. And I was like, oh no, like we've built this on such a shoddy foundation with the best of intentions, but profits should be a byproduct of taking care of your people. And this is the fundamental shift that I think needs to happen. And so it's validating to know that while this seems obvious, it gets lost in practice because of short-termism.
Yeah. Hamza, this has just been a really fun conversation. I know at the time I'm going to need to let you go and get on with your busy day. But before we wrap things up for today, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, your team, where they can find your book, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Certainly. And I appreciate how flexible you were with this conversation and answering my questions as well. It's felt more like a dialogue versus an interview. So thank you, sir, for being very generous. I have all of my links compiled for the listeners at hamzakhan.ca. That's HAMZA or ZA for my fellow Americans. HAMZAKHAN.ca. And the company that I'm building right now with my partner is Skills Camp. It's a soft skills training company, very similar to the organization that you are building right now, Dr. Westover. So much so that I sent the link. I was like, take a look. This is our North Star over here. Skillscamp.co, SKILLSCAMP.co.
Wonderful. Hamza, it has been a pleasure. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I forgot to mention the final word on the topic. If you could take anything that I've said today and just distill it down to 3 words, put people first.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you so much. I encourage the audience to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Hamza can do for you. Check out his book. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day.